every single inverted yield curve. Once it reinverts, once it goes back to normal where you're getting paid more on the longer maturity than on the shorter, every single time since 1950, I don't know how many it's been, 8 or 10 times, it precedes a recession. And in other words, what you're seeing is the high probability of a big recession coming. And the reason I say big recession is because it might have been, I think, the most inverted yield curve in history, massively inverted for a very long time. And when it reinverts, the probability going back to 1950 would be 100% if you look at what it has been in the past. I guess it doesn't mean it's exactly 100%, but a high probability we're heading into a recession. And so when you see the yield curve reinverting, to me, what that basically says is that you have big money who understand the banks. The banks are not lending the money to you and me. The banks are not lending money to you and me to start a business, to buy a property, to do a home equity loan. They would rather take that money and not lend it out into the economy because they don't like what they see coming. And instead, they're loading up on short-term treasuries, which is pushing the yield down. So as the yield goes down in the short-term treasuries, because the big money, the banks would rather put it in there with safety by treasuries than lend it to you and I, is an ominous sign. They are front-running what they see coming.
Since 1950, every instance of an inverted yield curve returning to normal has preceded a recession. Currently, we are facing the most significant inversion in history, indicating a high probability of an impending economic downturn. Major US banks are prioritizing the safety of short-term treasuries over lending to businesses and consumers, signaling their anticipation of an economic storm. This shift reflects their concern about the current economic landscape and the potential for a severe recession. With banks choosing to place their funds in treasuries rather than riskier loans, the implications for the economy could be severe. Reduced lending may lead to economic stagnation, as businesses struggle to secure financing for growth and consumers find it harder to obtain credit. This move suggests a lack of confidence in the economy's immediate future, highlighting the need for vigilance and preparedness. As we delve deeper into these developments, we explore what this means for the US economy and your financial future.
You got the Federal Reserve that has come out and admitted to $1 trillion in paper losses right now, in unrealized losses. You have a situation where the stock market has turned sour on the Big Seven, and that's a dangerous environment in and of itself, where the market has been lifted by 7 stocks. And here's the interesting thing. You know, right now, if you look at the NASDAQ, which has been hit fairly hard, in just doing a little bit of research on it, you find that there are more industrial stocks right now listed on the NASDAQ than technology stocks. And in fact, even more financial stocks than technology stocks on the NASDAQ. And I found it interesting when we talk about breadth, B-R-E-D-T-H, and how horrible it's been, where, you know, typically when you have just a handful of stocks leading the way, it doesn't portray for good future direction. Typically it's a bad omen, and we're seeing it turn over right now. Will it continue to fall? I don't know. But just so people understand what I mean by breadth, if you had randomly chosen a basket of 30 tech stocks at the beginning of 2022 in the NASDAQ, you'd be down today. And, you know, so almost all of the stocks in the NASDAQ have been in a bear market since late 2022, with the exception of a handful. You look at the Russell 2000, a broader swath of the economy. They represent the broad economy. Almost all of them are down. And so when we talk about the macro picture, look, we have a situation where now you got the Fed talking about lowering rates. What does that mean? We have a yield curve, which has been massively inverted for 2 years. And the inversion of the yield curve is basically, if you said to me, Andy, can you borrow me some gold? Can you borrow me $5,000 worth of gold? And I said, okay, Danny, how long do you need that for? 6 months. All right, I'll charge you 2%. Okay, great. And then you come back to me and say, Andy, can I borrow $5,000 worth of gold and pay you in 10 years? Okay, Danny, I'll charge you 8%. Well, the inversion of the yield curve says you're getting a higher rate on the short loan that I'm lending to you versus the long loan. And who would ever, it just doesn't make sense, right? You're supposed to get more of a return for the longer the duration. Not only is it the greater likelihood you don't get paid back because of the variables, but the opportunity cost of not having use of that money for a longer period of time. And that's what inverted means. For the last 2 years, you're getting paid more money on a 90-day or a 6-month treasury than you would be on a 10-year treasury. That's a very unusual situation. But going back to 1950, Danny, every single inverted yield curve, once it reinverts, once it goes back to normal where you're getting paid more on the longer maturity than on the shorter, every single time since 1950, I don't know how many it's been, 8 or 10 times, it precedes a recession. And in other words, what you're seeing is the high probability of a big recession coming. And the reason I say big recession is because it might have been, I think, the most inverted yield curve in history, massively inverted for a very long time. And when it reinverts, the probability going back to 1950 would be 100% if you look at what it has been in the past. I guess it doesn't mean it's exactly 100%, but a high probability we're heading into a recession. And so when you see the yield curve reinverting, to me, what that basically says is that you have big money who understand the banks. The banks are not lending the money to you and me. The banks are not lending money to you and me to start a business, to buy a property, to do a home equity loan. They would rather take that money and not lend it out into the economy because they don't like what they see coming. And instead, they're loading up on short-term treasuries, which is pushing the yield down. So as the yield goes down in the short-term treasuries, because the big money, the banks would rather put it in there with safety by treasuries than lend it to you and I, is an ominous sign. They are front running what they see coming. And so they're anticipating that the Fed will lower yields on the short-term treasuries, which they're going to do. And so when you talk about what this really means, I mean, if it is portraying a recession and the economy starts to slow down, and the banks aren't lending and instead are going into treasury short term because they know that things are going to get ugly and they don't want to lend it, and we head into a recession, I think that you'll see rates go even further down on the short end because it will start to really clog up the economy, really slow down the economy in a big way, create a recession, if not worse. And then you have this urban doom loop that I think people need to understand a little bit more. This urban doom loop, which, you got all of these half-empty buildings, and 70% of the loans are owned by the regional banks, as are 70% of the small business loans. And these banks are these buildings are half-empty, and all of the shops and restaurants that have spawned up around these big buildings, these office buildings. Well, you throw into it the lawlessness in the inner cities and all of the immigration problems in the inner cities, and the fact that people aren't in these office buildings. So what happens is the people in the office buildings start to go work from home. The people around the businesses around the offices, well, they start to suffer and start to close. So people start to leave. And as people leave, you end up having less in the way of tax revenue, the tax revenue that comes in as a result of all of these commercial properties and all the businesses, which is integral to services within the economy. Well, they start to suffer. And as a result, the quality of life starts to suffer. So people leave. And it's a doom loop. And it's getting worse and worse and worse and worse. And I often talk about the craziest one I've seen so far is the one in St. Louis, the former One AT&T Center, 44-story tall building, third biggest building in St. Louis, and sold for $205 million in 2006. It just sold for $3.7 million. $3.7 million for the fourth tallest building in St. Louis. And as it gets worse and worse and worse, and more people leave, less tax revenue going to the police and the fire and all of these services, garbage collection, whatnot, well, then the quality of living gets worse. So more people leave, which just reinforces this urban doom loop. I hate to be pessimistic, and we were talking about that too. There's a fine line between realism and pessimism. But I think if you don't see what's coming, you'll never get out of the way of it, Danny. And so, unfortunately, I'm a hopeful guy, but I don't like what I see right now. And when you see the Fed talking about lowering rates, and you see the curve reinverting as a result of the banks not lending money and just piling it into short-term treasuries because they do not like what they see coming. So instead of lending it with risk, they'll put it with the Fed and no risk. Yeah, I would say we're in store for some tough times. And then you throw into it the biggest election in the history of this country and all the crap that's going on around it. Yeah, it's time for people to be defensive, in my opinion. It is not about return on your money, it's return of it. And when we start to see cracks in the NASDAQ like we are, in the big seven, which have really been the catalyst for all of the market growth, it's dangerous because people in this country have become addicted to instant gratification, and that's not fast enough. And so you have all these people that have loaded into NVIDIA and into Apple, and what does it mean when they correct, if they do really correct? It's a big problem. So yeah, unfortunately, Danny, my take on the economy is not as rosy as I would like it to be right now.